Hey, welcome back, guys. So my name's Anthony Chambers. I am a real estate agent here in California. And on this channel, as you know, I just talk about most things that have to do with real estate. And today what we're going to talk about is the dreaded situation of an appraisal coming in lower than what the buyer offered. So let's go ahead and talk about that. So you've accepted an offer and you're going through the transaction with the buyer, and they call in their lender's appraiser and the appraisal comes in lower than what the buyer offered. What happens then? So this is actually a really stressful situation for both the buyer, the seller, basically everybody who's involved in the transaction. And it doesn't happen quite as often as it used to. However, it does still happen. And how can you handle the situation, and what are the options when this comes about? So the first thing that comes to mind is there is a dispute process that the buyer can go through with their lender. So basically what happens is the lender and the buyer are going to submit comparable properties and their rebuttal to why the appraisal should have been higher than what was listed on the report that was sent over. So I'll be honest with you, the few times that I did see this report submitted, nothing actually changed. The appraisal was left the same, the price was not changed, and we had to negotiate in a different way. But that is one potential scenario where you would just dispute the price with the lender, and hopefully they will change the appraised value to match what the buyer had submitted on the offer. The second thing that can happen during this situation is the seller can lower the price to what the appraisal says and move on with the transaction. So for example, if the home is offered at $125,000 and the appraisal comes back at $100,000, the seller would then drop the price down to match the appraisal, and then everything continues as it normally would. Now, the difficult thing with that is usually my clients, the seller, have already spent the money in their head for, let's just say, the $125,000. So it's a lot of burden for them to lower the price. So again, that's going to be a negotiation that you're going to want to talk to with the listing agent and the buyer's agent. The third situation that can happen when the appraisal comes in lower than what was offered by the buyer is the buyer can write a check for that variance and then continue the transaction. So again, just to make the numbers round, again, if we were selling the house at $125,000, but the appraisal came in at $100,000, the buyer has the option, if they have the cash available, to increase their down payment by that $25,000 variance. And by doing so, the lender is still going to issue whatever percentage of the loan that they were going to send out, but that will increase the down payment for the buyer. And again, that's usually a pretty big burden unless they have a lot of cash in their bank. So if they're only able to come up with 3% of the purchase price or 3.5%, and then to get hit with another $25,000 on top of that, that is something that can ruin or end the real estate transaction. And the last option that I see most often when this happens is a negotiation between the buyer and seller. So again, we'll use the $125,000 as an example. So if the buyer offered $125,000, the appraisal came in at $100,000. Once they negotiate back and forth, a lot of times what happens is the buyer and seller will split the difference at some percentage or another, depending on the buyer's finances, depending on the seller's willingness to sell the home at that lower price. So for example, if it's a $25,000 variance, sometimes the seller would drop the price by $12,500, and then the buyer would have to increase their down payment by $12,500 to make up for that difference in the appraisal price. And the last option, which does happen, and it's really an unfortunate situation for everyone, is the seller is not willing to lower the price and the buyer just doesn't have enough money to come up with that variation in price, and then the transaction is just canceled. So what happens basically is the buyer says, hey, I don't have enough money to cover that additional down payment. Can you lower the price for us? And the seller says, no, I'm not financially able to lower the price to match the appraised price, so we will have to cancel the transaction. So at that point, the seller is just going to cancel, and then it's going to go back on the market, and we're going to continue looking for another buyer that's willing to pay that amount. And there you have it. What about you? Have you been in this situation before? If so, leave me a comment below. I'm kind of curious to see how that works out in your buyer transaction or seller transaction. And I hope you found the video useful. If so, click thumbs up, and I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks again for watching.